Hey guys, welcome back. My name is Anike and I am so excited to get to be teaching with you guys again. We are doing our last video in our series on shadows in the Old Testament. And this week we are talking about the Book of Ruth. Some background on this book. The events in the Book of Ruth took place during the time of Judges. So if you've ever read the Book of Judges, Ruth comes right after that. And if you've ever read the Book of Judges, you know how awful the events in that book are. People go from bad to worse. And the book infamously ends by saying, "And everyone did what was right in his own eyes." So the person reading right through the Bible would finish Judges and be super caught off guard by what they find in the Book of Ruth. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, start by talking about these questions with your group. Now, as we go throughout this lesson, we're going to find that our main point is that Jesus is our ultimate Redeemer because he repurchased us by his blood on the cross. Now, Ruth was a Moabite woman who was married to a Jewish man. Her mother-in-law was named Naomi, and her husband and her had 2 sons, one of which was Ruth's husband. There was a famine in the land, and Naomi's husband died along with her 2 sons, which means Ruth's husband also died, leaving both of them widowed. Now, you have to understand, this is obviously a super devastating moment just in itself, but in this culture, survival depends on the man, which is why not having husbands or sons was so devastating to these women. In this culture, men were the only ones who could get decent jobs to provide for their families, which left widows vulnerable because they had no man to provide for them. So when Ruth announces that she's not going to go back to her mother's household where she would be stable and live in a home, and instead stays with Naomi, she's throwing away every chance of having a stable life in order to be with Naomi. So after they make this decision, Ruth and Naomi go back to Bethlehem, where Ruth then gains permission from Naomi to go into a field to glean. If you've never heard of gleaning before, that just means that she's going to go and pick up the leftovers from whatever the reapers, the workers in the field, leave behind. This, however, was pretty dangerous for women because it left them vulnerable to the men who were working in the field to gather grain for the owner of the field. So Ruth finds herself in this field owned by a man named Boaz, who she will find out later is a close relative of hers, of her deceased husband's, and a potential kinsman redeemer. Halfway through her day of gathering, Boaz comes into the field. In Ruth 2, 8-9, he says to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go and glean in another field, or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Now in your groups, you guys just read that passage from Judges and the passage from Ruth, and you contrasted them. It's really crazy how different those are. And one of the characteristics of the men during the time of Judges in the book you just read was this characteristic of taking from women. But then we see Boaz, who is the stark contrast because instead of taking from Ruth, he does everything that he can to give to her. He takes nothing from Ruth, but instead gives to her. Boaz had nothing to gain from Ruth, but instead served her, just as Jesus had nothing to gain from us, but instead served us. In Matthew 20:28, Jesus says, "Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." See, we had nothing to offer Jesus, but instead he gave us everything to give to us. Boaz had nothing to gain from Ruth, but instead served her, just as Jesus had nothing to gain from us, but instead served us. Pause here and talk about these questions with your group. So Ruth goes home and reports to Naomi, who informs Ruth that the man who was so kind to her, the man whose field she worked in, Boaz, is a kinsman redeemer. Now, if you've never heard the word redeem or redeemer before, a redeemer is just a person who buys back land and a widow in order to give the widow power and status. So you can see this glimmer of hope that comes up for Ruth and Naomi as they realize that Ruth has found favor in the eyes of a man who is a potential kinsman redeemer. In Ruth 3:9, they come up with a plan. And Ruth goes and enacts this plan. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she said, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are Redeemer." Now, I realize this is a strange interaction, but don't get caught up in the cultural differences. What we see here is a vulnerable woman putting herself in an even riskier situation. She listens to the advice of a wise woman, and then she humbles herself and puts herself in a position of extreme vulnerability. If Ruth is rejected now, she not only loses her chance of being redeemed, but she would also not be allowed back into the field in order to gain grain for food, which Naomi and Ruth both need. So why on earth would she do this? One, because she recognizes her position. She understands that she's already in a vulnerable position. And two, because she knows she needs another person to do for her what she can't do for herself. Ruth recognized her own vulnerability and submitted to the one who could redeem her, just as we need to recognize our vulnerability and submit to the one who can redeem us. In the same way, our sin and badness puts us in an extremely vulnerable position before a holy God. We are a foreigner to God, without power or status or relevancy. We can try to bring our good works, but at the end of the day, we find ourselves in spiritual poverty. But Boaz's descendant, who would be Jesus, who is our Redeemer, tells us that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. We can trust that when we submit to this Redeemer, he won't fail us and he will care for us. Ruth recognized her own vulnerability and submitted to the one who could redeem her, just as we need to recognize our vulnerability and submit to the one who can redeem us. Now, in suspense, we return to hear Boaz's response. In Ruth 3:10-13, he says, "And he said to her, 'May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after younger men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet There is a Redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you." This response is absolutely beautiful. And I want you guys to hear the determination in Boaz's voice when he says these things. He's not just saying a nice thing to say a nice thing. What he's saying, he says he will mean it. He's going to be faithful to Ruth. So in the end, Boaz ends up being the one to redeem Ruth. And Boaz brings Ruth up out of her poverty and into abundance of life. He gives her power and status, and he provides for her in the ways that as a widow she couldn't provide for herself. Boaz redeems Ruth by his own money, just as Jesus redeems us by his own blood. When Jesus went to the cross, he paid the price in order to redeem us. Not with money or with coins, but with his precious blood. The cost for our redemption was high, unfathomable, but he gave everything for us. Romans 3:24-25 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by grace as a gift, through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith." Boaz redeems Ruth with his own money, just as Jesus redeems us by his own precious blood. Friends, I really don't want us to miss the deep beauty of these events that took place here. Don't get caught up in the theological terms of redemption, but really see this picture that Christ paints for us here. She, who had nothing, was destined to scrounge the earth as a beggar, but he who had everything he needed and needed nothing from her stooped down to lift her up. With his own hands, he purchased her back into freedom, and out of his overflow, he pours all he has over her for no other reason than to lavish on her. And with deep joy, she simply receives. Friends, this is a shadow of our story, the story. We, who had nothing, were destined to scrounge the earth as beggars. But he who had everything and had no reason to do anything for us and had nothing to gain from us, left his throne in heaven to die on a bloody cross, to purchase back a people who frankly don't even want him. Friends, I don't know where each one of you are at with the Lord, but if you don't remember anything else from this lesson, remember this. Revelations 5:9. "And they sang a new song, saying, 'Worthy are you to take the scroll and open its seals. For you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed a people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation.'" Friends, go in the knowledge that this God gave everything for nothing and no other purpose than to lavish on you. I'll see you next week.